The moment the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was signed, it became obvious that Poland would be invaded. This was the communists fired the starting gun for the Nazis. The Nazis then invade Poland and fire the starting gun for the Soviets. They are not counteropposed ideologies. They are very much cooperative ideologies. And whenever you think who was responsible for which more crimes, Hitler or Stalin, let's not forget they were both responsible for each other's crimes.
Daniel Finkelstein's mother was nearly killed in the Holocaust. His father nearly died in the Gulag. His family story encapsulates the horrors committed by the Nazis and the Communists in the 20th century. In his superb book, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, Daniel makes some of the worst moments in modern history into a story about real people who you get to know and care about. Daniel, your mother, her sister, and their mother were all sent by the Nazis to Belsen. What were the conditions like in Belsen? What was life like?
My aunt kept a little diary and it gave me an idea of what the conditions were. The most impressive thing were the number of times it said no food, or worse still, that it pulled out some meagre offering, the fact that they got peas, and put it in this diary with an exclamation mark, because most of the time they didn't get any food or very little food at all. So they had very small amount of rations, possibly less than 500 calories in a day. That was one of the reports, and that was at a relatively early stage of Belsen. Belsen later declined, and as it got towards the end, people really were starving.
So part of their conditions was working for one of them in the shoe factory. Can you explain what the shoe factory was?
My aunt, because she was over the age of 16, had to go to work. My mother spent all day sitting, doing pretty much nothing. She didn't have the energy to do anything either, but she was only 10 and then 11, and she didn't have anything to do all day. But my aunt had to go to work very early in the morning, and they sat at a table where in the men's room they were picking apart old shoes that had been sent to Belsen from the extermination camps, basically the shoes of dead children, the shoes of dead adults, and they were passed through for the women's room to do some of the removing of the buckles or bits of leather that could then be reused in the German war effort. They were able to talk to each other, but the atmosphere was so awful. The dirt, the noise, the oppressive task relentlessly being asked of them 6.5 days a week. On the remaining half a day of the week, they would often end up having to stand in the square and be counted, something the Nazis did in Belsen partly as a form of control, partly as a form of torture. And they would use that on a Sunday afternoon, knowing that it was the only rest time, and they would have to do this in and out, and various people end up dying sometimes of blood poisoning or exhaustion.
I mean, how long would they be kept standing?
Well, they weren't standing. They were able to sit with others at a table, and that was pretty much the only relief. The only thing that you might say about this task, as compared to, say, working in the kitchens, that was advantageous. So if you worked in the kitchens, it started earlier in the morning. There was always the risk you might be tempted to steal something and then, as happened to one of my mother's relatives, never be seen again. Whereas in the shoe factory, you could at least sit down, you could talk to the other people, but it would last your day 12 hours with perhaps half an hour, which I use the word lunch lightly, which there was no work and you were able to eat what part of your rations you thought you could spare at that time.
But with the roll call, were they standing for the roll call?
Yes.
So how long would they stand for the roll call?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, it varied. So it might be relatively short, but often it would last for hours. And the reason it did that, and that wouldn't matter what the weather was like, They would be asked to stand for hours. Sometimes my mother had the impression that the Nazis would expand the length of time when the weather was worse. They would be in their trench coats and in their big thick shoes, and they would have these prisoners shivering in their night shirts or whatever rags they really still had by that point. And often people would just die on the spot, and the counting would continue, and later somebody would come along with a cart and remove the corpses that remained on the floor. And since there wasn't any real chance of escape, nobody was going to go anywhere. The counting served only one function, really, which was to control the people who lived there. And Belsen was not an extermination camp, but this succeeded in exterminating quite a lot of people. And for those it didn't exterminate, it was serious torture.
So, I mean, I was trying to help people understand why this was so serious. You're talking about people who are extreme in winter, middle of winter, it may be freezing, they're very, very hungry, and they're standing for hours in the cold.
Exactly.
So, I mean, you've got to imagine this happening day after day after day.
Yes, so it's important to understand about Belsen is the trajectory. Belsen was established by Himmler originally as an exchange camp. He had an idea that the Nazis might lose the war, and he might then be able to swap Jews for weapons or for other Germans who lived in Allied occupied countries, or for money. And he put those people in this exchange camp in Belsen. And when they began, the idea was that these Jews wouldn't be there maybe that long, because he had an optimistic view about how many people he was going to be able to exchange, and was deluded about his own guilt. And as the war went on and people were not exchanged, the situation in Belsen begins to deteriorate, partly because other people from other concentration camps are being resettled. And you'll be aware Anne Frank was brought to Belsen. She was not an exchange Jew, unlike my mother, who had a Paraguayan passport. She was not an exchange Jew. My mother saw her arrive, and those people were in even worse position in terms of hunger than the people who were exchange Jews, and everybody ends up progressively starving or suffering from the disease that's inevitable when you get a large number of people and put them together without any sanitation. And the people were dying, and the corpses were being left between the barracks. That people were defecating or urinating near the places where people were sleeping, or, if they had anything to eat, eating. And naturally speaking, Belsen declined. And while it declined, this form of gathering people together became a worse and worse ordeal. And it was, it was something my mother recalled happening on the very first day they arrived. But on the very first day they arrived, though it was an awful thing to have to endure, 2 hours standing when you're a young girl and you wonder what the purpose is and where it will lead, it was endurable. As the Belsen began to sink into what's been described by its official historian as an inferno, as it began to go towards that, this form of counting became a worse and worse torture.
Yes. There was always the risk, or increasingly the risk, of being sent to Auschwitz, which must have been incredibly nerve-wracking. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, so originally the Jews are collected in a camp called Westerbork. This was a camp that actually been originally set up by the Dutch government, funded by Jews, to hold people who'd come over from Germany, were effectively illegal immigrants but couldn't leave, and the Dutch government, as a sort of concession to ensure those people didn't have to leave, were willing to set up this camp. They built it and the Jewish community paid for it. The Nazis took over that camp, and in Westerbork it was possible, unlike in Belsen later, to have some form of life, however miserable it was and however much you were I've got lots of correspondence. My one of the most touching is from my grandmother to my aunt on her 16th birthday, and it just shows, the whole tone of it shows how much the imprisonment, they were suffering from the imprisonment, but a life was at least possible. except for this, that every Tuesday there would be a transport to either Auschwitz or Sobibor. Now, people have often heard of Auschwitz because when you went to Auschwitz, there was a selection. Some people were selected to go directly to the gas chamber, an older woman, for example, or a young child. They had no slave or work value to the Nazis, and there would be someone on the rampway, and they would assess them instantly, and they would be sent to die. But there were some people who were sent to work, and the people who were sent to work, some of those survived, and we therefore know something of the story of Auschwitz. Sobibor, the life that you lived in Sobibor, the average life of a Jew in Sobibor was 3 hours. And there were only 18 people of the 30,000 who were transported to Sobibor who survived because they went elsewhere. They were sent when they got to Sobibor. They were used for some task and they didn't therefore die. But Sobibor was the place in which my great aunt, Trudy, or Nutty as she was known by the family, with my great uncle Jan, my mother's first cousin Fritz, they all died in Sobibor on a train that simply took them into a factory process of death. That while you remained in Westerbork, that was almost inevitable that it would catch up with you in the end, even if you had these exemptions that Himmler had created in order to be able to fill his camp of exchange Jews.
But there was a regular moment when you would either be on the list with the possibility of be going straight to execution or not.
There was a rhythm.
So you had a build-up of tension on a regular basis.
Yes, and what happened was that Gemecke, the commandant of Westerbork, would get his instructions about how many Jews were needed. He would gather together the sort of Jewish leaders in the camp. He would discuss with them how many people he needed and which exemptions would therefore hold this week. And it was, one of the things that's so interesting about almost all totalitarian regimes is this combination of a kind of rigorous, relentless oppression and the capriciousness of the system. So Gemecke would sometimes decide that women and ill people should be exempt, and sometimes he would say those are precisely the people who should be sent first. And it wasn't obvious, in any given week which that would be. But this list would get created. There would clearly be a lot of kind of scrambling by people to try and stay off the list, and usually unsuccessfully. And then on Sunday night, by Sunday afternoon, it was being finalised, and on Sunday night, the list would be read on Monday night, the list would be read in the barracks. And preparation would then be made for the next day, for the Tuesday transports. And this took place each week. And if you look at Ruth's diary, my aunt's diary, you'll see this process where she says, Dieneke, her friend, arrives in Westerbork from Amsterdam. Then 2 days later, she meets Dieneke. And they obviously talk to each other as friends in the diary. And then a few days after that, she records Dieneke is on the transport.
So it's like a weekly Russian roulette. You don't
Absolutely.
know whether you're going to get
Absolutely.
it.
And imagine the tension of it. Now, my family did have some falsely created documentation that allowed them to not be on these transports. So there are 2 or 3 occasions where they come very close to it because their particular exemption is deemed by Gemecke not to hold. But they didn't know for sure each week
whether it would hold or not.
That would be hold or not, and you can imagine the tension that creates then, even for those people, which is not that many, who survive through this process, but they have to survive each week. When I studied this, and I understood from my aunt's diaries and from my mother's testimonies and from the testimony of her siblings what this was like, the thing that most struck me was this idea of each Monday night, my mother having to sit in the barracks while these lists were read out. And she, by that point, would probably have known she wasn't on them, but experiencing other people at the age of 10, or as she was, experiencing other people learning that they were to be deported. And there's another point here, which is they kind of begun to understand that what the deportation to the East meant. That it meant
namely death. Yes. And then moving forward, because of these fake Paraguayan passports, which they were very fortunate to get hold of, they managed to get on a train. They went across to Switzerland, crossed the border. But throughout the time when they had been in Belsen, your mother's mother, Greta, had prioritized the feeding of her children, as you came to realize, or they came to realize, over the feeding herself. She was incredibly weak. What happened to your mother's mother on arrival in Switzerland?
Let me tell you that, but before I do, let me say that one of the documents I found in my mother, which I did not know existed, in a shoebox of papers, I couldn't at first make out. It was in blunt pencil. It was clearly in Greta's handwriting, my grandmother's handwriting, which I did recognise. And I tried to make it out, and I realised the first word in this document was the word omelette, which I couldn't understand. When I had this document translated, which sadly I needed to have, I realised it was a list of her recipes. And the reason that she'd written them down, I'm almost certain, is that people in Belsen did nothing but talk about food. They didn't have much else to talk about, and they were trying to conjure up the thought of food because it was an alternative to the reality of it. Greta herself was particularly hungry because she was giving the food to the children. And she begins to weaken significantly. By November in 1944, she is actually given the dispensation not to work. She can stay in the barracks because she's so unwell. And she gets onto the train that takes them to freedom only with an immense act of will. The Germans didn't want to send anyone to the exchange that they did, this one tiny exchange, who wasn't going to make it, partly because they didn't want to expose what they were doing, and partly because it would be a nuisance if they took someone and they turned out not to count towards the total of freed prisoners that they could exchange. So my grandmother had managed to sort of stand up straight long enough to get onto this train, but she begins to fade as the train goes. And at one point, actually, they throw off the train some Jews. They had too many. They throw off the train some Jews, and my aunt appeals to the guard that she can't be moved because she's too ill, and the guard actually just shrugs his shoulders and lets them stay on the train. They get across the border, and my grandfather gets a telegram in New York, where he is, saying, your children and your wife have been on this exchange, they're freed. And then it says the children are safe, and then it finishes with this sickening line that Greta has passed away upon weakness, as they're using the phrase past spelt B-A-S-T, upon weakness, Jewish funeral in Kreuzlingen.
So, to put it simply, she made a supreme effort to enable them to get out. She had previously made a great sacrifice in not feeding herself as well as her children. She was extraordinarily weakened by the whole experience. And then on finally the relief of getting through to Switzerland, she died of the exhaustion and hunger and perhaps illness that she had suffered.
Look, it's a defeat of the body, but a triumph of the soul.
Absolutely.
I think that she represents to me always human defiance and compassion in the way of this machine of oppression and starvation and imprisonment. And so when I was young, she obviously wasn't there, and I knew about her, but one of these enticements to tell my story was to understand this amazing person, and I think I did get to understand her. So that was one of the greatest satisfactions of this work. But when I read the audio book, I had to do that 3 times because I couldn't get it through without crying.
Yeah. And do you regard her as being a victim of the Holocaust, even though she didn't go to the gas chambers?
Oh, completely. Of course she was. Yeah, I mean, it's funny you should ask that question, and it never occurred to me.
I just wanted to make it explicit.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're right. You're right to do that. I did once have an exchange with a reader of the Times who attempted to suggest to me that Anne Frank wasn't a victim of the Holocaust since she died of diseases. But obviously, if you bring people into an area, the sanitation collapses, the food isn't provided. Let's put it this way: Greta wouldn't have died in her home in Charlottenburg, Berlin, before they chose to conquer countries and imprison, one ethnic group.
Great. Now, I want to, the fact that you exist is a kind of miracle. The fact that your parents survived is also, is before that a miracle. And I want to sort of try and bring out how rare and exceptional and lucky you are, because you're a living person and you, in a way, represent thousands of people who died. And I wondered if you'd read out this part of your book where you list members of people who were in the street.
Absolutely. So I'm reading here about the inhabitants of Jan van Extraat. When my family was exiled from Germany, they remade their life in a street called Jan van Extraat. It's quite a Jewish area of Amsterdam, and I write about in my book about the life that everyone led, the shops that they shopped in, the games that the children played, and finish the chapter with this. The inhabitants of 1 Jan van Extraat were murdered by gas in Sobibor. Number 3 killed in Amsterdam. Number 5 murdered by gas in Sobibor. Number 8 murdered by gas in Auschwitz. Number 9 murdered by gas in Sobibor. Number 11 starved to death in Belsen. Number 12 murdered by gas in Sobibor. Number 13 starved to death in Belsen. Number 14 murdered by gas in Auschwitz. Number 15 murdered by gas in Auschwitz. Number 17 murdered by gas in Auschwitz. Number 19 murdered by gas in Auschwitz. Number 22 murdered by gas in Sobibor. Number 22 flat 2 murdered by gas in Sobibor. Number 23 starved to death in Belsen. Number 24 murdered by gas in Sobibor. Number 25 murdered by gas in Sobibor. Number 26 murdered by gas in Auschwitz. Number 28 killed in Mauthausen. Number 29 murdered by gas in Sobibor. Number 30 murdered by gas in Auschwitz. Number 32 starved to death in Belsen. Number 34 murdered by gas in Auschwitz. Number 37 starved to death in Belsen. And number 39 murdered by gas in Sobibor. It would be easier to identify houses that the killers didn't visit. 90 people murdered in a single short street.
Yes, it's gruesomely brings it home. Your father, he was raised in what was then Lvov in Poland, but is now Lviv in Ukraine. This was taken over by the Soviet Union, which soon set about getting rid of members of the Polish elite. His family certainly qualified as such. So your father's father was taken away by the Soviet secret police. Then they came for your father and his mother. They were sent to a collective farm. They didn't have any choice in the matter, in a cattle truck. Your father was 10 years old, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. So he went to a farm, I think it's in Kazakhstan. Can you describe what the conditions were like in their first winter in that farm and how close they got to dying?
Absolutely. The Nazis arrested everybody who was Jewish, many of whom happened to be shopkeepers, and the Soviets arrested everybody who was a shopkeeper, many of whom happened to be Jewish. But my parents could see the correspondence between their experiences. My father and my grandmother arrive alone in a farm many thousands of miles away from where they lived. having lost everything just in a few possessions, and they have no home. In this small farm, there's nowhere to put these Poles who've been exiled to work in this oppressive and compulsory farm. So they're told, well, the cattle are actually on the steps, so you can use their shed to live in. But eventually they have to leave that because the cows need their home back, and they build a home out of cow dung. They've been making, my grandmother had been put to work making cow dung bricks. They're allowed to use some of these to build their own house. My grandmother had to do this herself with a few other Polish women. Some of the house then in the porch that they built ends up collapsing. They have somebody comes along and sort of digs them an entrance, and the winter comes. The first thing that happens when the winter comes, there are 6 of them. One of them is a young lady, Zosia Potocka, in her 20s and her late 20s. She gets, she begins to feel ill. My grandmother can just about go out. It was just about enough. The weather was just about good enough to go out. She goes to see the head of the farm and says she needs a doctor, and the head of the farm says, I'm not going to send for a doctor, he's a day away, and it'll take him a day to get back, and so we can't call a doctor out for one person. And my grandmother says, if you don't do that, she'll die. And his response was, well, everyone dies, even great doctors die. And Zosia Potocka starts to scream in agony, and she screams and screams until she stops screaming. This is all in this little room, which gradually becomes colder and colder.
So this is a mud hut in the middle of winter in a very cold place. Yes. The inside, it is below freezing.
Inside it's below freezing.
And they have practically no food, and they have to get water every day from the river, and even getting to the water is a major difficult operation.
Yes, my grandmother has to crawl out of the entrance to this hut, the porch having collapsed. They'd sort of created this entrance, and then she has to make her way through this driving wind and incredible snow down to the river. Then she has to carry the buckets back, and they've got no way of heating anything, so they had no fuel. They have just about enough food, and the food came because her sister was in Lvov, and her brother, and they sent these parcels which came right the way across the Soviet Union, and some of them arrive. I've got actually...
Do you think she would have survived without those parcels?
No, she is of the view that she wouldn't have done.
So she would have died without them?
She describes them as her great good fortune, yes. And I mean, by this point, by the way, you couldn't buy anything very much in Lvov. The Soviets had arrived in Lvov, now they've turned it into Lviv, and brought their economic system with them. So it had ended up with these massive queues. You could hardly buy anything, but her sister used, and also, by the way, her husband, who'd been in my grandmother's brother-in-law had been an attorney. By now he was a rat catcher. They had no money. Their savings had been wiped out. So they just about managed to get some of this food, and much of it is then lost. But they do just have enough that they could survive.
So they had just enough food to survive, but they were very weak because they were so hungry and so cold. And as you say, one of the 6 people in this hut got a disease and died. Your father, at one point, you say he literally couldn't stand.
Yes. So
he was 11 years old by then, and he could not stand.
Yes. He's leaving the house when it begins to thaw. The house, I call it the house, the hut, when it begins to thaw, and his first experience is really to collapse. And he also recalls that when he was revived, he did meet some other person on the farm, and they said, "Oh, I thought you were dead, Finkelstein." And he said, "Well, no, I'm actually not dead." And the man said, "Oh, well, next year." That was the way that human life was regarded. And had one dictator not invaded
I know where you're going, but let's just leave that for... But can I just ask you, first of all,
Absolutely.
What were Soviet visas?
They were the kind of abscesses and boils that you had on your body at the end of this experience. And they stayed on my father's body for years. That's what they were given this title, Soviet visas, which suggests that the humans can still find humour even in the darkest situation.
Yeah. That spring, if I'm not mistaken, of the 90 Poles who were in that farm, 12 had to be buried.
Had already died. So, my father came to the obvious conclusion this would definitely happen to them if they stayed there long enough. The one thing he thought might help is if he collected enough cow dung to provide fuel for the following winter. So that's the thing that he did. But truthfully, disease or starvation might well have caught up with him anyway.
Yeah. So I'm going to want to jump now to your father's father, who was imprisoned, arrested and imprisoned prior to your father. What happened to him? I mean, he had in a way a more severe experience.
Yeah, so looking at the experience of all of my family, my mother always used to have this phrase, it's not a competition. So she had not much patience for people going, which was worse. And I think his experience was certainly at least as bad as the worst experience of any of the other members of the family. Not at least apart from the ones that were directly murdered. He was, and he never really recovers from this. He goes on the night of his arrest to the Brigidki prison, which is in Lvov, not 3 minutes walk from the opera house where the grand operas were held, and he would go with his wife on great nights. And he is in this Brigidki prison, and the thrust of the accusation against him, and it's made to everyone. It would be made if you were somebody who was a philatelist who happened to have international contacts, or a school teacher, was that he was strengthening the might of capitalist Poland. Eventually, after being bounced around through several prisons, he ends up in a place called Starobelsk, and in Starobelsk they appear one day and inform him that he's been found guilty of the crimes they've been interrogating him over.
They were missing out the interrogation, though. I mean, interrogation was no picnic.
No. So at first, nobody speaks to the prisoners at all, and eventually they come to be quite grateful for that, because the alternative to that was the interrogation. And this would include, usually you would be taken before your actual interrogation to a small room, and you'd have to wait for your interrogation, and you could then hear other people being beaten up or guns being fired. My grandfather was never sure whether that was fake or real, and truthfully the record would allow for either. Maybe both were true. And you would then be taken to the interrogation, and I don't know much about his specific interrogation, but anybody can find out about interrogations.
So you assume he would be beaten?
I do assume that. He does not say that directly, so one has to be careful about what one says with the evidence, but I do assume that. Certainly the interrogations were a very tough experience, and my grandfather felt that nothing he said really had any value to these people, and he even posited to my father perhaps they were training at how to ask questions. But I think a more likely explanation is that the answers didn't matter, because the sentences and the conviction of the sentences were not dependent on the answers, really. Whether you confessed or whether you didn't confess, they preferred a confession because it was then easier for them to justify to their bosses, but it didn't really matter. And so ultimately they sentenced him without ever really, allowing him any kind of free response to the accusations, and he got 8 years in the Gulag.
And that was on course. The work in the Gulag was on course to kill him too, because it was very, very cold.
Look, he's nearly 50 years old by this point.
It was manual labour.
Exactly. So the first thing that's important, and this I think is an important part of a totalitarian story, he had to get there first. And any story about people who are in gulags or concentration camps, first of all, you had to get to hell, you had to travel to hell. And that was really awful a lot of the time. It was often in a closed carriage, rumbling along for week upon week. with often no food at all. If there was food, it might be salted fish, which meant you didn't have it. You were then incredibly thirsty. You might be able to reach out and get snow, and that's what my grandfather did. But the journey was appalling, a part of the experience. Ultimately, you would arrive at this at the Gulag, and my grandfather was put to work as a pack horse, effectively dragging these logs to the river. Now, the point of the Gulag was twofold. It was to suppress dissent as a punishment, a destruction of the elite, and it was designed to be of economic value to the Soviet Union. Who on earth would put Daniel Finkelstein, known as the Iron King of Lvov, a great quartermaster and organizer, who on earth would allocate him the task of pulling logs to the river? Right? It's an illustration of the kind of and this was supposed to be economically efficient, and it's an example of the stupidity as well as evil of command economies.
He did manage, for reasons we can come on to get out and to meet up with his wife and get out, but he didn't live long, did he? No. He died at the age of 59.
Yes.
And what did the doctor who knew him, what was his view of his relatively early death?
He said that it was due to his experiences in the Gulag. And my grandfather he'd become depressed. He was physically emaciated. He had repeated bouts of heart disease, and his younger brother Bernard died of typhus while helping to build the railroad in Iran as part of their journey. And both of them were clearly weakened by this experience, to the point where the doctor was explicit. He said he felt that the death owed itself directly to that. So that was, my grandmother obtained that letter from him later.
So in a way, you could say he was killed by the Soviet Gulag.
I absolutely think that. If only that was all they'd done to him, actually. If on the first night of his arrest, as they did to tens of thousands of other people, they'd shot Dolu, it might in some ways have been a blessing. But they put him through an unimaginable torture, and they deprived him of his family for long periods. He didn't know whether they were alive or dead. They stole all of his money, and he dies in a small house in Hendon Central, having lost his whole path in life. And one of the things that's really struck me strongly while researching my parents' story is how important that part of it is. So we concentrate on, not unreasonably, on the death and disease and physical hardships that people face. But this incredible dislocation of their lives, I certainly think was at least an equal disaster.
So, we've concentrated here on two parallel stories. One member of your family being oppressed by the Nazis, and another by the Soviets. How would you compare these two totalitarian regimes, and how would you compare how they are now remembered?
It is not necessary to try some sort of scoring system in order to simply conclude that both Hitler and Stalin represent unimaginable evil against the human spirit, against human existence, against, as I said earlier, the soul. And my mum and dad never really questioned the fact that the experiences they'd had corresponded to each other. They never really ever thought that was in question. If you look at the experience of the family, the exile, the starvation, the confiscation, the arbitrary murder, the imprisonment of young children, made to feel as though they're part of the elite, that Stalin and Hitler were trying to destroy, either because they were Jewish or because they were the son of somebody who'd done well in business. These things were, I think they never doubted that they were corresponded to each other.
And what about how their two regimes are remembered now?
Well,
and taught?
Eventually my mother begins to make speeches in schools, and she speaks in lots of different schools, including my son's. She's invited to address the Chancellor of Exchequer's children. She meets the Prime Minister. She does a documentary for the BBC in which she meets Albert Speer's daughter. She's telling her story all the time, and partly there was an extra fascination of her having known Anne Frank, but it was also because Holocaust stories are shared and told. Nobody ever asked my father to give a speech about it, and I've had the experience since the book's been published of people who worked with him as a professor and only very vaguely knew anything about his experiences. And it wasn't because he wasn't willing to tell you if you asked him, it's just nobody asked him. And people really don't know this story. One of the first things I did when I was writing the book, I took out the first folder of things that I'd been given when I was first interested in my grandparents, and my grandfather's partner had given me, his second wife had given me a folder which had cuttings about my mother's dad, and in it, the first document I pull out was the indictment of the Nuremberg conspirators. He had his own personal copy of that, quite a thing to have in your hand. And I read it, and as I was reading it, I realised that everything that the Nazis were convicted of at Nuremberg, all of the crimes, the crimes against humanity, the crimes against peace, the crimes of war, the conspiracy to do all of those things, all of those the Soviets had done as well. But they are not remembered for having done them because they were the prosecuting authority at Nuremberg, not the defendants. One of my father's best friends, a woman called Aldona Paneth, Aldona Paneth and her mother, Yadja Shraga, Aldona's stepfather, Yadja's husband, Ignacy, is one of the officers who's shot by Stalin, who shoots 20,000 leading Poles, many of them Polish military officers, at Katyn. The Soviets attempted to prosecute the Nazis at Nuremberg for Katyn.
For the crime that they themselves
had done.
Crime
that they themselves, and not only that, the crimes they knew they'd committed, because it wasn't something that was done by some underling, in this sort of famous phrase that's a mistake made by a junior official. It was Stalin and Beria and Molotov signed the order that these officers were reactionary elements who would be killed summarily without being informed that sentence had been passed. They knew exactly what had happened to these people, and they went on lying about it for decades. And they attempted to prosecute the Nazis. And here, I think in Katyn, you have this extraordinary experience where the Nazis are attempting to express horror that this crime had been committed, a crime they would completely have been capable of committing themselves. Indeed, did commit. Tens of thousands of people arbitrarily murdered, one after the other shot. And the Soviets are denying the murder they knew they committed. And if ever there was a proof of the kind of cooperative spirit, I think Katyn is as strong in its sort of sense of hypocrisy and outrage as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the agreement in the first place between the Soviets and the Nazis that allowed all these things to happen.
Well, hang on. Let's just be explicit. The Katyn massacre was where Polish elite were shot one after another and put into mass graves.
Absolutely.
Over 22,000 of them were simply shot in the back of the neck or back of the head.
Yes.
And then you refer to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That is effectively that they were the foreign ministers of the Soviet Union and of Nazi Germany, respectively. And but effectively, it was, you could call it the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Of because they were just the foreign ministers,
Completely.
and the real pact was between Hitler and Stalin.
Completely. They congratulated each other on it.
And it was a deal by which they would basically carve up Poland. The Soviet Union would have the eastern side and the Nazis would have the west. You think that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was particularly important for your family. Can you explain why?
Yeah, it's the single most important moment in the life of both my mother and my father. This agreement allows the Germans to invade Poland from one end and the Soviets to invade from the other end. Thus, it leads directly to the imprisonment of my grandfather and of my father. And at the same time, of course, it allows Hitler to invade the Low Countries, to invade Holland, for example, knowing full well that he won't be, he'll be able to do that without Soviet intervention. So it's a crucial moment, and importantly, they have a common understanding of the ideological reasons. It was a pact not just caused by convenience, and certainly not a non-aggression pact. It was better seen as an aggression pact, and it was and it had an ideological base, which was to fight liberal democratic capitalism in favour of alternative systems, which posit that the spirit of the people has been frustrated by an elite. In Hitler's case, he believed the elite was the conniving Jews, and in Stalin's case, it was that he believed it was the conniving capitalists, a lot of whom were Jews, or some of whom at least were Jews, in his view probably more than was actually the case. And that idea formed the basis for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So now communists will argue that it was merely out of convenience. And it's very important to emphasize the ideological basis for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And completely, if you read my grandfather's correspondence, he is lying in a hotel by the, on the Sun Lounger on the day, the Patria Hotel, on the day that Ribbentrop and Molotov are negotiating the final bits of their pact. And he believes that he will be able to return home, that the cloud of war will dissipate, because they didn't think that Hitler would be able to invade when everyone opposed Hitler. The moment the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was signed, it became obvious that Poland would be invaded. This was, the communists fired the starting gun for the Nazis. The Nazis then invade Poland and fire the starting gun for the Soviets. They are not counter-opposed ideologies. They are very much cooperative ideologies. And whenever you think who was responsible for which more crimes, Hitler or Stalin, let's not forget they were both responsible for each other's crimes.
And to bring it down to your family level, the invasion of Netherlands resulted in your mother being taken to Belsen and your grandmother dying, and the invasion of what was then the eastern side of Poland resulted in your father's side of the family being taken to gulags and your grandfather dying eventually.
While the Soviets moved smoothly into Herbatov Street, where my grandfather had built his house, and out of my father's window moved the Secretary General of the Ukrainian Communist Party, and they became neighbours of Khrushchev, not something that they wanted to be.
Yes, quite. And I hope we can just briefly mention something that you've nearly gone into, and that is the role of Anders' army in saving your father's side of the family, because they would have died basically, wouldn't they?
Absolutely.
And they were saved by the creation of this extraordinary and relatively unknown army. In England it's unknown, but it's terribly important.
Yes, and look, it's the Anders army. I'll just briefly say what it is. We've talked about the fact that at Katyn, Stalin has murdered many of the officers, almost the whole cream of the Polish military,
except for one.
But Anders, General Anders, he hadn't murdered, because Anders had been wounded in battle, had gone to hospital, had not been with the main group when they shot everyone. So Beria turns up to the Lubyanka prison. They've got Anders there. He tells this startled and browbeaten prisoner, "You're going to be set free because we're going to put you in charge of an army." And when he's released, they give him his case back. In fact, it's someone else's case and has someone else's swimming trunks in them. And they sort of send him off without any shoes in a chauffeur-driven car to set off this makeshift army, of which they've already shot all the officers. And what Anders, in my view, symbolises is how much it can be national spirit can be a liberating force for all of the crimes of the Nazis. You have in Anders somebody in whom the spirit of Poland ran strong, and he, I think he was at one with, some of Pilsudski's vision of a multi-ethnic and Bartel's vision of a multi-ethnic modern Poland, and he would be a national leader, though he'd been appointed a military general almost by accident. He gathers together the Poles.
Hang on, but can we just say why Stalin had this volte-face and wanted a Polish army?
Well, Hitler had invaded.
Hitler had attacked him.
Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union.
Suddenly Stalin was allies with Britain and America,
Absolutely.
the allies, and so they were suddenly, Stalin and Britain were friends, and we with lots of the Polish government in exile said, well, release our people because you've got our people. And
Yes.
so they, after negotiations, surprisingly, the Soviet Union agrees, okay, we'll allow an army to be created of Poles.
Exactly, and they all unite in one part of the Soviet Union. It's very difficult for people to get all the way to the army. So lots of people die, or the families are separated on the way. It's by no means a smooth outcome. But some people, and this included my family, they were able to reunite. They did unite with Anders, and this army is formed. And Anders manages to persuade Stalin to allow them to make common cause with the British, rather than have to be part of the Soviet army. By which point, as you can imagine, they wanted simply to get out of the Soviet Union as quickly as they could, and they managed to get to Iran and become part of the British force in the Middle East.
So that's how Anders' army saved you. You exist because of Anders' army. It's one of the many. If not, you wouldn't be here.
I completely think that.
And at your parents having nearly died at the hands of these two murderous regimes, at your 50th birthday here in London, you made a little speech, and in front of your friends and family, and it was a speech. It's almost hard to say this, in favour of Britain, saying that there were good things about Britain. This is not usually said these days. Can you explain what you said and what you meant?
We're sitting pretty much where I said all this, but in my maiden speech in the House of Lords, I put it this way, that my father had been in Siberia, my mother had been in Belsen, and Pinner is nicer, Pinner being the place where I live and where we're now sitting. And I've occasionally been asked, do you not worry about the decline of big ideas in politics? And the way I always respond is, big ideas murdered my grandmother, and they exiled my grandfather, and they had a good go at starving my mother to death and my father to death, and they tried to freeze them when they couldn't starve them, and they stole every house that we had, all the business, every piece of furniture, every piece of cutlery, and I'm quite happy with the small ideas of this country. So I gave a toast at my party to the local dry cleaners, to Brent Cross Shopping Centre, to the Sunrise Cafe in North Harrow. I've often watched films, I give as an example American Beauty, where this kind of restless individuals are railing against the bourgeois existence and the fact that it's ground them down. And I think you can read the story of my parents and think, what a triumph the leaves on the line at Hendon Central Station is. How extraordinary are the banal things that we take for granted. There are lots of things that are wrong in any country, and one of the great things about liberal democracy is we can debate them vigorously, but let's never forget how wonderful it is to live in a free country under the rule of law, where dissent is possible, and where liberty is protected, and where prosperity is an objective for all people that the state supports.
I'm going to finish. Thank you very much, Daniel. I just want to say in closing, everybody should read this book. It should be in schools. It is an education in the 20th century, told in human terms. It's a very important book. Thank you. Thank you.